Welcome to the second Berges Lecture for 2016, sponsored by the John A. Berges Endowment. And before we begin, I'd like to introduce Jack Berges' son, Jim, and his sister, Ann, who are with us tonight. So let's give them a round of applause. I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Keith Sherin. He serves as chairman and CEO for GE Capital and vice chairman for GE Company. He previously served as GE's chief financial officer for 15 years, from 1998 to 2013. He told us over dinner it felt like 30, right, Keith? He was vice chairman in 2007. He joined in the early 80s after getting his degree from Notre Dame. He was employed by GE Aircraft and GE Plastics and GE Medical Systems. He spent some time in Europe as director of finance for GE Plastics Europe. As I said, he earned his undergrad degree from Notre Dame and an MBA from Columbia. And just recently, he announced his retirement at the end of the calendar year. And I was sent a very nice memo that Jeff Immelt, the current CEO, had a lot of good things to say about Keith, but I just want to share with you a couple lines here. Mr. Immelt said, "I've had the honor to work directly with Keith for about 20 years. It has been a pleasure. Keith is filled with intellect, curiosity, integrity, humility, and good humor. He could juggle 10 balls at once. I could trust him with any task, large or small." And I want to welcome Keith back to Notre Dame. He was here in 2009 to accept the Hesburgh Award. GE was the first company that we gave the Hesburgh Award for ethical and socially responsible business, and he was gracious enough to join us then, and I welcome him back tonight. And the topic of his talk is Roadmap for Ethical Leadership, for Ethics, in business leadership. Keith, it's a pleasure to have you back at Notre Dame.
Thank you, Pat. It's a pleasure for me to be back here. And I told Pat I really don't need any charts tonight. I have some, but you look at what's happening in the world, and you just got to pick up the paper in the morning, and you can pick a couple stories and come in and talk about them. So I thought tonight I'd talk a little bit about examples of things that you read about or you're familiar with, and then I got a couple things from GE. And then I really want to just lay out a couple simple principles that I follow, that GE follows, and talk about how you create a ethical business environment in a world that's full of pressure. And you have to, let's say, there. Did that help? Sorry about that. So I just have a couple of points that I want to make tonight about a simple roadmap for ethics and business leadership. And hopefully we'll have time for Q&A as well. So I've just got a few charts and then we'll get into the discussion. So, the first thing that everybody thinks about in their organization is that ethics and integrity are part of your values and your mission statement. Clearly at Notre Dame, and certainly Mendoza distinguishes itself with their focus on ethics. And I think it differentiates you when you're being recruited, especially today. I think business leaders are looking for people with the right values and people who can understand and debate a situation that might have some gray area and come out with a roadmap that is the right decision, doing things the right way. And Mendoza clearly teaches that. I think it's a real tribute to the school that they've integrated ethics into all the classes. GE, we clearly talk about ethics as an important part of our values, an important part of our culture, and so does every other company. So people have it in their mission statement. People say they're ethical. Every CEO will say the company has a culture that includes ethics and integrity. But why do they continually get it wrong? How does everything happen in an enterprise to lead to situations like you've seen over the last 15 years? I mean, Enron was just an amazing disaster. The environment was go, go, go. And people took it to an extreme, and eventually the company went bankrupt and the executives went to jail. You look at 2008 Siemens, the largest Foreign Corrupt Practices Act fine ever, $800 million, bribery all around the world. Some of that comes from a cultural difference in Europe, where some of that was allowed for years and years and years, but certainly by 2008 with Siemens as a U.S. registrant and publishing financial statements in the country here, there was no way any of that was legal. And then just the last several years, you look 12 to 16, I just picked a few, but you know, the banks, obviously through the financial crisis, the things that they've had to go through with their programs where they've been found to have underwritten, sold faulty mortgages. You look at the drug companies with incredibly poor practices around pharmaceuticals that aren't appropriate, and the selling practices where they're incenting doctors to buy products and prescribe products that aren't really appropriate for the situation. You know, you look at the cars companies with recalls, and then recently VW as an example. I had just a little bit about VW. I thought I'd just show for a second here. Maybe getting this to play, do you think? Not going to play. So, yeah, I'm going to talk about VW, then we'll go to another one that's current. So, you know, you look at VW, here's a company that had become #1 in market share in the world in car sales, and that was their goal, and maybe it was how they set that goal and how they incented people and how they rewarded people that led to this, but you know, the CEO in the video talks about these things that went wrong and others, you know, a culture of fear, you know, a reign of terror where performance was driven by fear and intimidation. I mean, that's a terrible culture. Results at all costs, you know, tolerated breaches of the rules. These are the executives of the company and talking about that. Detection failed, the chain of errors. It's always, someone always says, well, there's 7 things went wrong that can't go wrong. That's not always true. I think that in hindsight you look at it and you see there were a lot of signs, but if you had the right systems and processes and leadership in place, you wouldn't have had those errors. And then the leaders abdicating, remarkable to say that, you know, I'm not aware that I did anything wrong. I mean, that's not exactly setting a standard for leadership and integrity in a company. So I thought I'd just talk about the one that's in the paper today, was Wells Fargo. So here's Wells Fargo, probably the most reputable bank subsequent to the financial crisis, and $185 million fine they agreed to with the OCC, the Office of the Control of the Currency, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And they admit that they've had employees open over 2 million fake accounts, and that over the last 5 years they've fired 5,000 people involved in this situation. And now they're going to get another set of investigations. But you know, you think about that situation here where 5,000 people have been fired for opening fake accounts to meet sales targets, to have multiple products per customer, and the leadership says it was some bad people. I mean, the first time that you saw someone opening fake accounts, you should have said, what is going on here? You should have looked across the enterprise and said, where else could this be happening? You should have examined what the incentives were that were in place that would allow that to happen, and people should have been able to speak up and raise that issue the minute it started. I mean, it's a complete cultural question for me about, you know, a bank that has an incredible reputation, great leadership. We partner with them all the time. We love them. But to have this type of situation come up, it just raises so many questions about the fabric of the integrity system inside that company. So anyway, I'm sure this video won't work either, but GE, we're not immune. I've thrown 3 examples up here, but I spent 15 years as the CFO and the last 3 years at GE Capital. As the CFO, I was part of the Policy Compliance Review Board for the company where all the major integrity cases came. And I'm familiar with, you know, dozens and dozens and dozens of cases. These are 3 really public ones that we had. Back in the late 90s, early 90s, our business in aircraft engines sold a bunch of engines for military planes in Israel. And a whistleblower inside of GE Aviation went to the government and said, the government has paid for things that were never delivered. And I was on the audit staff at the time and led the investigation of this. It turns out that one of our sales and marketing leaders conspired with an Israeli general to get paid like $20 million for a test cell that we never built. And when you go through the paperwork and you look at everything, there were lots of red flags. There were lots of people who saw things and didn't raise questions. And at the end of the day, we did pay $20 million into various accounts for 2 people, and they split the money. And at the end of the day, we paid a $69 million fine. Welch had to testify in front of Congress. We were banned from the government for selling products for a while. That ban was lifted when we went into a full cooperation mode with the Department of Justice to go through this investigation. And what we ended up doing, we had probably about 20 people who lost their jobs, including a couple officers, for not having an environment and a set of processes and for not picking up on red flags that were very clear. And then we also had a massive internal relook at our open reporting culture about why people didn't talk to us about the problem and why did they go and use a whistleblower system with the government. So it was a big case inside the company, and a massive amount of change happened as a result of it. In early 2000s, another, again, a place where you say this can't happen. In Japan, Tokyo Electric Power was our largest customer, and we did inspections, nuclear inspections for Tokyo Electric Power with their people, and their people asked our inspectors to falsify the nuclear inspection reports about cracks inside the reactors. So you say to yourself, that is not something that should ever happen. You know, if you're talking about skipping rules and not following procedures, you don't do it in a nuclear power plant. And they had it, it just sort of became an acceptable thing for the customer. The customer asked our technicians to lie about the reports. We actually have videos that show, here's an inside movie of the inside of a reactor, and then the movie would go fuzzy for a second, and then it would be over here. So they just would skip some of the cracks. They edited the reports for the government and changed, so they would file a report with TEPCO, and they'd file a false report that had the cracks omitted. And they said there were no safety issues, and at the end it turned out there weren't safety issues, but it's still something that's completely unacceptable. In 2004, Jeff Immelt and I were over in Japan, and this investigation it really exploded in Japan, and TEPCO was under massive amount of pressure, and we knew we were in trouble, because normally when you go over and you meet with the team, you would be whisked up to this conference room, you'd have a great customer relationship dinner. We had to find our way to the conference room. We barely made it through security. We find our way to the conference room. They made us wait like an hour, and we had a translator who had always worked with us in Japan, and we trusted her. She was really great. And I'm sitting there, and I'm trying to, you know, just keep track of everything. And so she's translating the CEO of TEPCO, who's saying, it's really important that you're here. We appreciate you coming. Because of the importance of our customer relationship, we hope that you will sign this letter that we prepared for you that basically says that all the things that you've alleged about the false reporting about the nuclear tests didn't happen. And both Immelt and I are like, did she just translate that? Is that what he really said? And we almost fell off our chair. And we basically said, we can't do that. It's just completely inappropriate. And we didn't. And about 15 people inside of GE, the TEPCO CEO actually did lose his job, and a number of others inside of TEPCO. But we had about 15 people, including a couple officers who also lost their job inside of GE. And not because, like, the officer in charge of the nuclear business didn't do anything wrong, but he didn't set up an infrastructure around a major risk area that would have detected and prevented and captured information around a red flag that was as important as something like this. So he didn't set the right culture, and he didn't set the right infrastructure. So that was an incredible example. In 2007, we had acquired a healthcare equipment business that makes x-rays equipment for surgeries. And the business was growing fantastic. Financial performance was terrific. We had what we thought a highly respected leader in the business. But they had an FDA audit, and the FDA audit found like 20 things, and our team completely dismissed it, said it's bullshit. They reported upward that there were inappropriate findings, that it's nitpicking, it's not right. We ended up with, again, a whistleblower who went to the FDA, and the FDA came back in a year later and found like 16 findings, and basically at the end of the day we ended up shutting down the plant. We ended up going into a consent decree. We were unable to ship product for almost a year, and we lost over $100 million. A number of people, again, lost their job. So these, even in a company where ethics and integrity, where you talk about it all the time, I can't tell you how much you have to reinforce it, how you have to spend so much time on it, you have to have everything about your infrastructure support it, or it gets away from you. And those are just 3 examples in GE, but there's plenty more. And how you respond differentiates you. And in every one of these examples, when we find it, immediately we investigate it, and we fully cooperate with whatever government agency we're dealing with to have them understand that we will do whatever work they need and we'll provide all the information and we'll get to the bottom of it, and whatever it is, we're going to deal with it, no matter how bad it is. So there's really three simple little things that you talk about, but they're really hard to get right in a company, to have an infrastructure and a culture and a leadership environment around integrity. Number one for me is prevention. The leaders own it. I'm going to cover that more in a minute, but it's not just the tone from the top. It's not just having a policy. It's not just giving a speech. It's your personal behavior. The entire organization knows if you're faking it. You know, if you're aggressive on your expense accounts, everybody will be aggressive on their expense accounts. You know, if you're looking the other way when you're doing a commercial transaction, all of a sudden it gets away from the entire organization. So you're not only your tone, but your personal leadership defines the culture for the company. And then the organization infrastructure that you put in place is so important. So we hold our leaders accountable, not just for their personal integrity, you got to be a role model, but for your risk areas, you need to make sure that you put the infrastructure in place to identify red flags, to put the appropriate resources around processes that you need to deal with, and we're going to hold you accountable. And in the leadership team, the top 500 or 600 people, at every leadership meeting we have when they're together, there's one message from Jeff Immelt: it's one strike and you're out. So, you know, you got to set the environment right, and by the way, you got to put the infrastructure in place to deal with the red flags and the risks that you're taking on in your business, so that you don't put the company's reputation at risk. So I think this is by far the most important: the leadership environment, the culture, the attitude, and certainly what your own personal integrity and role model behavior is. That really matters. In the middle, detection. Probably the most important process that we have inside of GE is around open reporting. We have thousands of ombuds people. We put a ton of resource into this. We advertise it, we promote it, we want people to report, we want people to submit it either on a name basis or anonymously. We want, if you have a question, raise it. You know, you're encouraged to talk to your manager, you're encouraged to talk. A lot of the cases that come into the ombud system are around personnel management and human resource practices and things like that, but a lot of them really are around potential illegal activity or things that people don't understand, that are people doing it right and they only see a piece of the process, and where are the other controls for the rest of the process. So this is a huge thing for us, is the open reporting, and then and the audit, data-driven, and then finally how you respond. That's important for the culture of the company, because, you know, if you put something into the ombud system and we tell you that anonymously you can put something in, or you can put it in on a name basis, and there will absolutely be no retaliation, and then suddenly there's retaliation, that shuts down the ombud system and you're completely ineffective, and you will not have that information flow. So you've got to respond appropriately. We have independent people who review these cases. We get back to the people who file the ombuds case. I've been involved in so many where someone did something anonymously, and I'd be like, okay, let's go to the whole organization and have an open meeting about it, and not, you know, try and identify who did what or who said what or who reported it, but make sure the whole team knows that we're dealing with something. What's the issue? How do we think about it? What are we going to do about it? So that the people who reported it anonymously will be able to get that information in a non-threatening way and show that you're open and transparent about how you're dealing with it. And then finally, dealing with the response with the government. There is no way to deal with the Department of Justice or the Federal Reserve or the FDA where you think you're going to stonewall somebody and get through any of this. I mean, if you don't have a completely open and transparent environment, you are going to get killed. It will never work, and you see that in company after company where they stonewall it, they deny it, and then all of a sudden they've got an independent review, and the board has an independent audit and legal firm, and next thing you know, it's all done appropriately anyway, but by a third party, and you've wasted a lot of time and resource and lost some of your reputation. So a little bit about the leadership. To me, I mentioned it, you know, the culture of integrity. Every one of the leaders is measured on this. Do you walk the talk? Do you spend enough time in your staff meetings? I mean, we can actually look at how often we talk about compliance and integrity. If you're involved in global sales, do you have and infrastructure to deal with sales agents and third-party reps. The largest red flag, dealing with a third party on a commercial transaction in a third world country. Do you have the infrastructure to make sure that you have vetted those resources, that you audit those resources, that you know that what you're paying for is getting an appropriate amount of value in the transaction, and it's just an incredible amount of resources that the leadership team has to put in place for these things, you know. In financial services, do you know your customer? Do you have a vetting process where every transaction that you do, you know who's you're providing the loan to, you know where the repayments are coming from, you know, so the infrastructure associated with the risk that you're dealing with in your business, your leadership measurement is making sure that you set the right tone from an integrity perspective and personal values, and then you put the processes and infrastructure in place to deal with the risks that you're dealing with. So these are really important. In terms of the operational construct in the company, the board of directors has designated the audit committee as responsible for compliance and integrity. They review the ombuds cases a couple times a year. We report the gross statistics, and then we review all the serious things that happen on a monthly basis with them. The Policy Compliance Review Board gets input from the corporate audit staff and the Ombuds Network, from the legal team and the finance organization. Everybody reports into one database. It's all tracked centrally for the entire company, and closure is measured on every single case, and then there's follow-up for every case. So this is an incredible infrastructure around leadership. These are the Ombuds cases. We got 3,300 in 2014, 3,800 in 2015, 4,600 in 2016. This is fantastic. I mean, if you have information flow, the reason it grew so much in 16 is we added Alstom. We bought Alstom, and they were under the second largest agreement with the Department of Justice on foreign bribery. We basically had to go in the acquisition. We had to sort of make sure that we finished the investigation for the Department of Justice, and then we had to talk to all the leaders about, you got to tell us everything you got, and you got to tell us that you understand what our policies are and how we're going to do business going forward, or you're in the wrong place. Probably 20, 25 people lost their jobs or left, and the rest sort of had an amnesty period to come into the GE culture, and then the ombuds complaints just flew through the roof. People just filing things saying, I'm not sure this is appropriate, I'm not sure this is appropriate, I'm not sure this is appropriate, and we just had to go out and follow all those. So that's why we have such a big number this year. But, you know, 3,000, 4,000 inside the company, people comfortable enough to file something to say, this may not be appropriate, this may not be right. About 40% of these cases get validated as an actual inappropriate transaction or event or process. As I said, about half of them are employee related, how you're treated by your manager, or discrimination, or hiring practices, or whatever. But the rest are all around everything. They're around travel and living. They're around controllership. They're around third-party sales. They're around dealing with suppliers. So this is an incredible network. If a company could have this information flow as part of their integrity system, it's a lifesaver, because the last thing you want is a disgruntled employee who knows something's going wrong to go to the government and say, I'm going to be a whistleblower and I'm going to get a big paycheck and I'm just going to do this without coming to the management team. And so with 4,000 or 5,000 of these coming to GE managers first, this is just a huge appropriate infrastructure investment for us to make sure that we find out about it first. And the reason it works is because we do have the integrity around not having any retaliation, and around getting to the bottom of these and reporting back to the employees that we're going to fix it and make it right, and we're going to deal with people who did things inappropriately with good discipline, and we make that public as well. So this is just such a huge part of the infrastructure around detection. And then more compliance isn't necessarily better when you talk about the infrastructure. We have a thing called the spirit in the letter. It's very simple. The spirit is you do things appropriately, you don't violate any laws, you treat people with respect. And then the letter is for every single type of area that's out there, whether it's Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or anti-competition law or controllership. There's a detailed set of principles, one page on each of those policy areas that all employees can read. And what we basically say is, look, you have to be alert and aware, and you have to understand your basic risk areas. And then you have to use the experts in the company when you get into any type of thing that's complex. and technically challenging, and go to the experts, whether it's a controllership expert or it's a legal expert. Use them to get this right. And so, you know, the spirit in the letter is something that all employees are required to read annually and sign and certify. And it's really quite simple and very straightforward, and it's sort of do the right thing all the time. And I think that's really better, simpler. All the training is a lot simpler. We're down to 2 hours, and then the annual acknowledgement is down to 120 words, and it's supported with a video by Jeff where everyone has to acknowledge it. So I think there's less is better here. You know, more policies and more procedures, people just gloss over. They glaze over. When you give them 120 pages of policies, they're like, I just can't even deal with it. You know, when you give them a page of principles, they say, okay, I think I understand this. So our keys inside the company, certainly most important is the personal behavior. I think if you're faking it at the top, if you're doing things that are a little bit shady, the entire organization knows it, and they pick up on those signals and they follow it. And we find that. When we find these examples where there's a problem in the company, usually the leader is not a transparent leader. They're a little arrogant. Maybe they're lacking confidence, and they get a little aggressive, whatever. We see some of the behavioral signs, and then there usually comes a problem at a point organizationally or from an integrity perspective that goes with it. So, you know, this is so important to me. And what's the most important thing for you in your business career? It's your personal reputation. You can't repair it. You can't fix it once you've damaged it. Your colleagues think about it every day when they deal with you, whether it's your coworkers or your boss or the people working for you. So I find this to be the most important. You know, open reporting, we cheer the Ombud system. I do videos all the time about, you know, open reporting is real. Use it. Learn how to use it. It's simple. You can do it on your PC. You can do it anonymously. Like I said, you can have someone else put it in for you through the audit system. I mean, there's so many ways. The right processes. If you're in charge of something that has a set of risks, you better build an infrastructure around identifying the red flags and, you know, doing the processes appropriately, and certainly dealing with issues that you see. I mean, that's where the Wells Fargo one for me blows my mind. I mean, if you fired 5 people because you're opening fake accounts, we would have immediately said, what the hell? The incentives are wrong, obviously. Someone's being measured on something, being pressured to do something that's inappropriate. We would have gotten to the bottom of it. We would have spread it around instead of suddenly finding you got 2 million of these accounts that have been falsely opened and blaming the employees for it. I think it's outrageous. So I think the leadership infrastructure around process is important. We have a whole set of processes where we do a thing called a session D once a year, where the leadership has to assess the risks in their business from a compliance perspective, a legal and other processes. And they have to identify the highest risks, and they have to identify their infrastructure around those risks. And they come in, we talk about it with the Policy Compliance Review Board, and we try and anticipate what's next. You know, if you see enforcement action changing at the FDA or the FAA or the Federal Reserve or the, you know, Consumer Compliance Protection Bureau, whatever those things are, if you're watching those external trends and you see things changing, what does it mean for your organization? And how do you refresh things when you think you have everything under control and you haven't had a problem for a while? How do you keep it alive? And so there's a lot around anticipating. And then following, the last one is really about our relationship with our regulators. We require all of our business leaders who are involved with regulators to actually know who they are on a first-name basis, to be familiar with them. You know, it doesn't do any good in terms of stopping an issue if you have a real issue, but it certainly is important that they understand what the tone is from that regulator about their oversight of your business. And that feedback allows you to then really understand what you need to maybe change and what you need to up your game on. So with that, that's a simple framework. That's a lot about how we think about it. It's not so easy, as evidenced by all the problems that companies have, including GE. I mean, we have over 300,000 employees. We're operating in 160 countries. We're going to have problems, and we know that. And if it's a leadership problem, we're going to find it, and you're going to get fired. And if it's a problem with a process somewhere, we hope we find it, we hope we fix it, and we hope we spread the practice to prevent it across the company as effectively as we can. So, and we rely on our employees to participate in this throughout the organization. So with that, I'd like to open it up and have questions on anything you want. Jimmy?
I got a question really.
Yeah.
On your ombudsman thing, typically you see a lot of American
Yeah.
Because there's a cultural thing, there's a language issue, there's a cultural issue. How are you dealing with that? How do
Yeah.
you get the Chinese to, because that's where a lot of the problems pop up.
Yeah.
Or in Mexico, or in, you're not necessarily getting the reporting from the places where the problems really are happening. You're getting a lot of complaints about supervisors and things like that.
Right.
Coming through the US system. Or is yours different?
No, so the question is, do you see cultural differences from different geographies about the use of the system? And we do. And what we basically have done is, for example, in China, it's not a cultural norm to really point out a problem somewhere in the organization in the hierarchy. We just have doubled down on the resources on it. We have our local Chinese leader do more videos per year on this than anywhere else. We have local Chinese ombuds people who are embedded in each of the businesses and available. And it doesn't prevent everything by far, but you have to double down on the places where you don't find it to be a cultural norm to speak up and raise questions about the hierarchy. And we just had to add more resources to really get at it. But we can see the caseloads in China relative to the size of our business and the volumes we do over years, and it could always, higher is always better for us. And then whenever we find something, usually what you find in China is a rev rec issue where somebody has sold something to a distributor and not taken revenue before it really got sold to the customer. And there was some local salesperson at a Target that they want to meet, and the audit is also an effective way in those areas when you don't know that the ombud system is great, but the audit is absolutely also a key part of what we have here for the compliance and integrity system. Yeah. Other questions, anything, things that weren't? Yes, hi.
Can you highlight some of the programs you have to kind of share the good news with people that are behaving ethically?
As part of the Policy Compliance Review Board, one of the big things we do is we reward and recognize people who file cases, even if they are found to be a problem. And so we will, for a case that comes into the ombud system and we find something that was really wrong, we'll take the people, if they're anonymous, it's harder, but if they're named cases, we'll take those people who brought that in and we'll recognize them publicly and we'll talk about what we learn and what we have to do as an organization, and we'll give them management awards and things like that. So the biggest thing is probably reward and recognition associated with ombuds cases that they file that turn out to be things that we need to improve. That's probably the biggest thing. There is a lot, it's a great question about prevention. Like people get recognized for cleaning up a problem. What about the organization that doesn't ever have the problem? That's embedded sort of in the leadership requirements and in your basic goals and objectives for the year. And people who run an operation that doesn't have that problem, that's embedded in sort of how they're rewarded and recognized in their incentive compensation as part of their annual goals and objectives. But it's a great, because the other people get a little more attention, right? You had to go and clean something up as opposed to someone who never had something happen. It's a real challenge in the organization. Yeah. Other things, hi. Yeah.
Well, in the last few weeks and months, there was a lot of questions, many questions about tax avoidance.
Yeah.
So can you tell us what is the policy of GE to deal with that sensitive issue?
Yeah, it's a great question about taxes. It's a subject where we have a very low tax rate. We have an incredible tax team, I think the best in the world. But then when we sit down with our tax team, the number one objective and the principle for them is to pay the appropriate amount of taxes everywhere in the world and to make sure that they follow the tax law everywhere in the world without taking any aggressive positions in gray areas that would affect the reputation of the company. And so it is a principle that the entire tax team knows from top down. We have not had any cases really where we had one case out of the last 20 years where we had something that would happen in a financing in the Netherlands that wasn't appropriate. But out of all the tax things that we've done, we haven't had anything where we've had something where someone did something inappropriate and we had to deal with the government on a rebate or a refund from an inappropriate tax position that we've taken. And that's something that's pretty remarkable given how complex that area is and how subjective that area is. But the principle is you will comply with all laws everywhere and you will not operate aggressively in anything that's gray that may be a position you could take and then deal with later. And that's a pretty strong position inside the company. Yeah, hi.
Do you also require or encourage your business partners to adopt ethical business leadership principles?
Yeah, our suppliers are required to follow our procedures around knowing their customers and around compliance, certainly around anything that's a government requirement for a contract. We'll flow whatever we have down to them. Our third-party sales agents and sales reps, I tell you, if you're ever involved in commercial operations globally and you have the choice to go direct or go through third parties, go direct. You will save yourself an immense amount of agony, and you will probably make a significant amount more money for the headaches that you'll face with third-party distribution. It's just almost impossible to due diligence and police and manage for what it's worth for you. So I would say if in your business career, if you're handed an operation that has a lot of third-party sales agents, beef up your compliance infrastructure immediately, or you're going to just spend your whole time dealing with problems, and it's not worth it. So we require all of our sales agents to actually sign and comply with the spirit in the letter to the extent allowed by law. So we flow the requirements forward commercially and backward to our supply chain as part of our infrastructure. Yeah, Jim.
Relative to regulators, you guys have, you're regulated more than, well, you're regulated more than most, probably because of the diversity.
Every business is regulated by at least,
So,
3 or 4 people.
But when you're dealing with the government, there's no good deed that goes unpunished. It's kind of a theme. So self-reporting is, so you get in this gray area where if you have a very small Foreign Corrupt Practices Act
Yeah.
event in a small town in China, and you find out about it, and you say, well, I really ought to report that, there's actually ex-Justice Department attorneys that will tell you not to report it.
Yeah.
Because you're gonna get your ass kicked around the room for a tiny little, so I don't know how, you wanna be open with them, and you
Yeah.
wanna know them, and you'd love to report it, but the punishment many times doesn't fit the crime, and in fact, I agree with you on the Wells Fargo thing. How could this much of this happen? But 2 million accounts, $1.5 million. It was 75 cents an account.
Yeah, crazy.
And they got a $183 million fine. And they self-reported, by the way.
Yeah.
And they're under a gag order to not say what they learned and how they learned and what they did about it.
Yeah.
That's what the government did to them. It put handcuffs on them. And so
Yeah,
it's kind of like they're driving you to be unethical, at least in terms of your reporting. So I don't know what your experience.
Yeah, so a lot of question around, do you report everything, and should you, and after dealing with the government, after you report everything, do you want to do it again? Anything substantial, we go right to the DOJ as soon as we can. We don't have a choice. We're a target. Our reputation matters. We have benefited more than we've lost by having that procedure and that principle. We will use outside counsel in a small case in China and decide, is this meet the requirement for what you have to do to report to the DOJ or whatever? We will evaluate that on a really small case or something like that. We'll have that discussion with our outside counsel and let the experts in the area decide. But anything that's substantial, we go right to them and say, we don't know everything yet, and here's what we have, and it's served us well more than it's hurt us. And again, like you said, I don't know what happened at Wells Fargo, but just based on what you read, you say that's a cultural problem, and an incentive problem, and a leadership problem, not a manager at a branch who decided to bring the bank down. But look, the government isn't going to be easy on any. Look, in your business, you are going to be regulated for a reason. The FDA has these procedures in place to protect consumers who are using that healthcare equipment from having a problem on a table while they're in an operation. And FAA, we make aircraft engines. The most important thing is that engine never fails while that plane is flying with people in it. So we're regulated for a reason. We we believe that they're there to serve a purpose and that we ought to comply with the rules. And if we do something wrong, we're going to take our medicine. And we have, as you saw a couple examples, but there's dozens of examples. And what you try and do is not have something become so big that it's systemic and it shakes the cultural fabric of your company. You try and catch it early. You try and have somebody, mostly like VW, why didn't someone say, you're falsifying, you're putting in software to fake the emissions test? That is inappropriate. Why didn't one person raise their hand? They don't have the right culture. I just can't even, you say to yourself, so, but you can see an example where 3 or 4 people, they've got a sales target. They've got a bonus that depends on it. They're going to work through the end of the year to get that done. How do you make sure that it permeates the entire organization? That's the challenge in a place that's got 300,000 people operating in 160 countries. And that's why you need this whole infrastructure to get at it as fast as you can. You're not going to prevent it all, but you got to make sure the leaders know that it's one strike and they're out, and that they got to build that infrastructure, and that employees ought to know that they're required to do that open reporting. They've got to sign the compliance on the spirit and the letter, and they're a part of the ethics and the reputation of the company, and then you hope for the best. I mean, you're not going to prevent it all. You're just not. Yes, hi.
When you introduced the anonymous reporting system, did you experience any kind of, there are many false reports or anything within the company? I mean, anything you could force falsely bad appraisals or anything?
The HR reports are varied, I would say. You get some that, like, they're 5 pages long and they're a conspiracy theory about somebody's aunt was really with somebody's uncle, and they in a country, and you're just like, I can't even read this thing. But for the majority of it, we encourage it. I think something like 40% are anonymous, and like I said, overall 40% of the cases get confirmed as something that's wrong. So it works for us. You just can't require it to all be named, or people are afraid of retaliation. In a small group, all of a sudden the auditors show up, people are going to look around and go, it's one of us, So you got to have it as an available thing, and then you got to really reinforce the no retaliation. I mean, a lot of times in the no retaliation, you end up removing the manager. The manager is doing something inappropriate and too aggressive, and then he will make life miserable for the person who did ultimately report. And we end up doing that. We remove the manager. If they're not doing a good leadership job and they're inappropriately dealing with their employees, we'll take them out. And this allows for a lot of that inside the system. Yeah, we'll have the HR team will investigate a lot of the HR complaints and deal with that. The auditors don't have to do as many of those. Yes, hi.
You've given a lot of examples of companies whose ethical values have failed them. Are there any over your time in this role, whether it's in your industry or in a different industry, that you've looked at and said, all right, that company, whether it's similar scale or smaller to you guys, that's done it right?
Yeah, there are. I'm trying to remember the name. Is it Ethisphere? Who's the magazine? They have a report every year. We're named a lot as one of the top companies for global integrity and what we do and how we do it. But there are many companies in there. P&G is a company that we model and follow. They've been a real role model for us. We deal with all the major Fortune 25 companies, and talk about what are their programs and infrastructure. There's a set of guidelines. The Department of Justice guidelines basically outline a set of things that you have to have an effective compliance program around policies and procedures, leadership infrastructure, open reporting, audit and detection, response. And if you follow all those things, you can get put in a different category when you get into trouble. So this is good for business. It's also good for the infrastructure of dealing with the regulators. And it follows the justice sentencing guidelines, which come down when you get to the end of a case and you're reviewing where are you. And cooperation and early reporting put you in the right place in terms of those sentencing guidelines for how things can end up. As Jim said, they can still end up really bad, but you'd be better off than if you didn't have all those things in place. Yeah, I would look at the Ethisphere for the top companies. It's pretty good. Every year they put out they do a great job. So up in the back, yeah, hi.
You mentioned that you can kind of, just in passing comments, you can see the signs of seeing deteriorating behavior. And I guess I was wondering, how long do you just monitor the behavior of certain employees before you actually act or prevent them from doing something extremely unethical?
It's really a case by case. okay, inside the company, we just don't tolerate bad behavior. You know, if somebody is acting inappropriately, personally, you're going to get found out. You're going to get told on, and you're going to get found out, and you'll be gone. You know, if they're doing something inappropriate, a relationship with a supplier or an employee or whatever, cheating on your T&L. I'm amazed. People are making a couple $100,000 a year, and they cheat on their T&L. How freaking stupid is that? You're going to get caught, and you're going to get fired. You know, so that's going to be found out inside the company. People are going to rat you out. But you know, if someone's a bad manager, a bad leader, it takes a little longer. You know, you're trying to coach them about, look, you don't yell at an employee on a conference call and berate them and belittle them. That's inappropriate behavior in this company. And they do it a couple times, then you're going to have to deal with them on this isn't going to work for you. But you know, we try and coach people. But so it's an individual situation. But the company in general, I would say, we just don't tolerate people who are jackasses. You know, but you have some, right? But we have really done a lot in the culture of the company to not have those people be rewarded, recognized, and successfully promoted. You know, that's a behavior that we don't tolerate, and we have a whole infrastructure around that. It's your boss, it's your feedback systems that we use, it's your HR team. So all those things kind of come together. That's just not tolerated. But you know, if you're in a service shop in India that doesn't have the visibility, you know, some of that stuff happens more often, and that's where things like the Ombud system can help you identify things that are off the main path. Orphans. There isn't a single orphan. An orphan for me is a business that makes very little money, that has a subscale market share, that's in a market that doesn't have any leadership oversight. You know, there may be the commercial operation for a business in Indonesia, and the boss is in Atlanta. That is ultimately going to turn into a cesspool for you, either commercially or compliance-wise or integrity-wise. So direct accountability with good leadership oversight, that's really important. But you end up with these orphans that you say, how did we end up with this thing here? And someone was trying to expand globally, and someone put in the resources and didn't put enough around it, and they end up, you know, not becoming successful and becoming a problem someday. Yeah, hi.
So you mentioned a lot about reputation. So my question kind of goes back to Wells Fargo, but also related to GE. How do you kind of, so for example, Wells Fargo, they're a $200 billion plus market cap company that make $20+ billion a year in net income. If you think about the $185 million fine, they fired 5,000 people, right? That's about $40,000 salary a year. They're going to make up for that loss in just laying off these people. So then the impact on their reputation, the brand, is much greater impact than that dollar value.
Yeah, not even close.
So how do you get people within your firm in this day and age where people are so mobile as far as jumping ship from one company to the next to really identify with your firm and identify with your brand and feel a connection to that?
It's a huge challenge. If you everywhere in the company, you look at the number of people who have been with the company 5 years or less, it's remarkable. It's 30-40%. The amount of influx of new people, whether it's hiring or acquisitions or whatever. And it's around your orientations, it's around your leadership messaging, it's around your communication that you do regularly. You just got to indoctrinate everybody in the culture, and you got to repeat it, you got to use it over and over and over, and then you got to follow through on it. And so, you know, it starts the day you're hired, it starts with your reading and talking about the spirit in the letter, it starts with your first compliance and integrity review with your leadership team, it starts when the first time you got to go do this session D to talk about compliance and identify the risks in your area and what are you doing about them. It starts when you're dealing with an ombuds case that you got to go through an investigation. And it's all about repetition of consistency of communication and follow through on the values that you're talking about. And we publish the cases. I mean, when we have a problem in healthcare, everybody in the company hears about it and learns about it and tries to, you know, share some lessons learned and pick up something out of it. So, but it's a never-ending challenge because you got all these new people. I mean, we brought in, I forget the number, 50,000 people with Alstom. And day 2, they're GE employees. Do they have the GE culture? There's no way. And you just gotta hammer away at it, communicate it, you gotta reinforce it, you gotta put the ombuds people in place, you gotta put the audits in place, you gotta make sure that people know what happens when things go wrong, and you encourage and reward the right behaviors. But that's why you have these problems, because you just have so many people that all the time are changing, and they don't really have all the same values, and some of them have different cultures, and you got to really work on it all the time. Yeah, I thought there was one more. Sorry, there was one up here. No. Yes, hi.
Hi, I know like GE and P&G are all big traditional companies, like with a long history and with mature regulation and policy. So how, what's your view on nowadays, like the emerging big companies like Uber, because they expand very quickly, and the regulation and policy has not been set up for many countries. And if they wait, they lose the opportunity. So, but this causes a lot of ethical problems or issues. So, what's your suggestion and what's your view for those companies?
Uber's a good example, or Airbnb. You know, how do they deal with the future regulations in a city? Should they wait and have that all figured out before they launch and become, get their market share they want? I think it's a real dilemma for them. I think their growth phase where they are, they're going to eventually end up having this infrastructure to deal with these sorts of issues for their employees, for the reputation of the company, right? I mean, look at what Uber's had to do around background checks that they didn't want to do. Look what they've had to do around cooperating with the local regulators around taxes and safety. They're eventually going to have to be forced into the regulatory system that mature companies have to deal with based on size and publicity. So I'd say they ought to be building it. They ought to be building that infrastructure and dealing with it. They're probably going to be chasing it for a while. I mean, we're a mature company and we have this infrastructure and we plug people into it. They're going to be building that infrastructure and chasing these issues probably and responding to them. It's a real distraction. I mean, you take a case like the healthcare case. I mean, the healthcare business was distracted by that for 3 years. The leadership team was spending an inordinate amount of time on it. They couldn't get it fixed. It happened to be a discussion with investors at every meeting. So not doing it appropriately is an incredible drain on business resources and leadership, and I think these companies are all going to have to build this. I don't know what's next for Facebook or Google or Uber or any of them. I mean, I don't think they have the infrastructure to deal with this stuff yet, but they're going to have to because these cases are going to come at them, whether it's a privacy or a cyber attack or some other thing that they're going to suddenly be vulnerable and playing defense on, and they're going to have to build an infrastructure. The other thing they're going to have to do is figure out how to do crisis management communications very effectively. We didn't really talk about it, but it's such a huge part of this is how do you communicate in a situation like this, and how do you respond internally and externally? And I didn't think Wells Fargo started off very well when the CEO comes out and says it was bad employees. It's just not. I don't know what the gag order said, but that was, and the woman got paid $120 million to leave. I don't think that was a really effective communication program. Yeah.
Keith, you're nearing the end of your career, and we have both MBA and undergrad students who are beginning their career. So maybe you could give them a few bits of advice or things that you've learned along the way that they could take away from tonight.
I think of two things. One, I'd say your personal integrity. There's nothing more important than your own reputation. And as I said, you can't fix it and repair it with your colleagues. And you can't rebuild it. And so, everything I do is to err on the side of not going near a gray area on anything associated with financial dealings with the company or participating with suppliers or anything. It's just always doing the right thing and making my decision compass be what's the right thing for GE. And if you talk to MLT or any of my colleagues or people I work with, when they bring me a problem, and we go through it, it's about what's right for GE for the long term. It's not about what was right for finance or GE Capital or Keith Sherin. So having a moral compass that you make your decisions with that protects your reputation, I think is just huge. And the other thing I'd say is if you get into a company and you don't like the culture, get the hell out of there. Because it's not going to change probably, and you're probably not going to be able to change it. And something is going to go wrong eventually, and you don't want to be there. If you don't want to be a part of that. So if you're in a place where people are looking the other way, or people are shortcutting, or people are cheating, get the hell out. You don't need it. It's not worth it. It's not worth it for your own personal reputation or stress or integrity. So those would be two things I'd say. Have a personal moral compass and get in a place where you like the culture.
Right. Great. Thank you.